Okay, so we're going to continue our story of Martin Luther, and we're going to now look at what happens to Luther now that all of the Pope's religious mechanisms have failed to stop Luther. So now we're going to keep looking at the Reformation, and we're going to keep looking at the life of Martin Luther. But now we're going to look at Luther and the political effects of what he's doing. So when we last saw Luther, Luther was being excommunicated by the Pope because Luther would not listen to the Pope's orders. So Luther broke with the Pope and was excommunicated, which Luther is okay with because Luther doesn't recognize the authority of the Pope and doesn't see excommunication as something that a person can do. You can't stop someone from communicating with God. Everybody can communicate with God. So Luther is like, this doesn't mean anything to me. But it does also mean that Luther and his work are now outlawed. And literally, outlawed means that you are outside the protection of the law. The only problem with that is that the Pope has no real political power outside of his own territory in Italy. So now the conflict between Luther and the Pope shifts to the political arena rather than the cultural and religious arena. So the Pope now has to rely on his political ally, the Holy Roman Emperor. To silence Luther. So the Holy Roman Emperor is one of these Habsburg guys. So he's a Habsburg. He is a very close ally to the Pope. So the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor are kind of two sides of a coin. The Pope is the spiritual leader of Europe. The Holy Roman Emperor is the political leader of a big part of Europe. So they're kind of forced to be allies. And in this sense, the Pope now has to rely on the Holy Roman Emperor to silence Luther for him because all of the Pope's tricks haven't worked. So in 1521, Luther is summoned to a trial presided over by the Holy Roman Emperor. He's summoned to a trial. He's promised safe passage to the trial. And the trial is held in the city of Worms. Yes, I know it looks like it's the city of Worms, but in German, W's make V sounds, so it's the city of Worms. Worms is in the little Germany called Saxony, and this is Luther's home region. So this is where Luther is from. He's from Saxony. He's going to a city here called Worms. And the guy in charge of Saxony is kind of a friend to Luther. So he is Frederick III, and his title is Elector of Saxony. And so he's called an elector because the Holy Roman Emperor is an elected position. And there are seven electors who get to vote for the Holy Roman Emperor. And Frederick of Saxony is one of these electors. It's not really an election. The Habsburgs win every time there is an election. But that's just his title. His title is Elector of Saxony. So he goes to this trial, and the trial is known as the Diet of Worms. And yes, I know it looks like Diet of Worms, but a diet is an old word for a meeting, and it's the diet that is held in the city of Worms, so Diet of Worms. At the Diet of Worms, Luther is accused of heresy, of kind of bucking the official Christianity. So he's accused of being a heretic. He's accused of not listening to the Pope. And Luther's response is, look, I'm following the Bible. It's you guys who are doing stuff that's not Christian. I'm not going to back down because it's not a good idea to make God angry. And I'm the one who's listening to God and following his rules, not you guys. So here I stand. I can't do anything else. God help me. That's essentially Luther's argument. And after the meeting, while they're still deciding, so they let Luther leave. They promise him safe passage. So after the meeting, while they're still deciding, Luther is kidnapped. He's not really kidnapped, but it's made to look like he's kidnapped. And for about a year and a half, for about 18 months, Luther hides in Wartburg Castle in Saxony. So he was fake kidnapped by Frederick III. So this is one of Frederick's castles. And while he's hiding there in this 18 months, Luther starts writing. So he first translates the Bible into German, which, remember, that's also what John Wycliffe did. He translated the Bible into English. So Luther translates the Bible into German so that everybody can read it. And he also starts writing additional, we'll just call them additional texts, kind of forming a new church. which will go on to become the Lutheran Church. Now, all of this stuff, all of his new things, so his new German Bible, the texts that are going to form the basis for this new church, all of this stuff is going to be published and printed and spread all over. And spread all over the Holy Roman Empire. So everybody's going to know about what Luther is doing. Now you might be asking yourself, why is Frederick helping him do this? Well, one thing you've got to keep in mind is that all of these smaller political leaders, like below the Holy Roman Emperor, so Frederick works for the Holy Roman Emperor, all of these guys have to follow what the Pope says. If the Holy Roman Emperor follows the Pope, so does Frederick. But if Luther can break from the Pope and become independent from the Church, so can Frederick. So if Frederick breaks from the Church, he gains a bunch of new independence. He can follow his own path. He doesn't have to follow the Holy Roman Emperor's path or the Pope's path. He can kind of do his own thing. So maybe he doesn't actually believe in anything Luther is saying, but he likes the idea of being independent, and so he'll follow that path if it means he can have a little bit more power. Now, starting in about 1522, Luther goes home to Wittenberg. The heat has died down. Luther feels like it's safe now to go back home, and he finds a really enthusiastic response. People like what he's been saying. And this is kind of the start of the Lutheran Church. So like the physical start of the Lutheran Church. And so we start to see a church that starts to act differently. Luther wanted this church to be more like the biblical church. This church needs to be more like the biblical church, the one that Jesus talks about in the Bible. So, for instance, anyone can speak to God. In the Catholic Church, only priests can do this. So you talk to the priest talks to you, or you talk to the priest talks to God, the priest talks to you and tells you what God said. The same thing for the Bible. So in the Catholic Church, the priest pretty much just tells you what's in the Bible because you can't speak Latin or you can't read at all. Or if you can read, you probably can't read Latin. So you pretty much got to take the priest's word for it. In Luther's church, anyone can speak to God and anyone can read the Bible. A big part of the Lutheran church was also teaching everyone how to read. That was also a big part of Lutheranism, teaching everyone to read. Because it's your responsibility to read the Bible. No one's going to do that for you. So you've got to read the Bible for yourself. So we've got to teach you how to read. Additionally, the leaders of the Lutheran Church would be part of the community. Meaning that the leaders of the Lutheran Church could get married. Catholic priests cannot get married. They're essentially married to the church. Luther made a big point of this. Luther purposefully married a former nun who also could not get married in the Catholic Church. They're also going to conduct all the services in vernacular languages.
Talia Cruz, please come to the front office if you're still on campus. Talia Cruz, please come to the front office.
Because nothing is supposed to be hidden. Nothing is supposed to be hidden. So up until the 1960s, Catholic church services were still done in Latin. But Lutheran church services were done in German so that you would know what you're being told. Basically, what Luther is doing, and if we want to kind of summarize all of this stuff, basically the idea is that Luther wanted to remove the hierarchy of the church. The church should not be a hierarchy. The church should be completely level. Everyone is the same in the eyes of God. So there shouldn't be a pope and bishops and priests who are above the rest of us. Everyone is the same in the eyes of God. And that's what Luther wanted his church to represent. Now, we'll end with this idea because this all sounds great. Luther is making things that are equal and fair. He's giving political leaders more space to do their own independent policies. They don't have to follow the Pope, but there's also a downside to this. So pretty much as soon as Luther gets going with all of it, poor people, so poor peasants, start flocking to Luther's church. Like all of this talk about equality and everyone being the same, this really appeals to poor people, especially because it's a new thing. They had to rely on the Catholic Church. They didn't necessarily like it, but it was the only church there was. But now Luther's offering them an alternative. And everybody who was kind of mad at the Catholic Church can now try this new church, and people are very enthusiastic about it. The only problem is that the poor people kind of misrepresent they misinterpret what Luther is saying. So the poor people misinterpret Luther's message. When they see Luther and Frederick disobey their leaders. So Luther disobeys the Pope, Frederick disobeys the Holy Roman Emperor. When they see these guys disobey their leaders, the peasants take this to mean they can disobey their landlords. And that means stop paying rent. And this starts a rebellion. This starts a rebellion that becomes known as the Peasants' War, or the Peasants' Rebellion. And this breaks out in 1525. Now, Luther may have privately sympathized with what the peasants were doing. But publicly, Luther could not support what the peasants were doing. So Luther had to publicly disagree with them. And this is what he said. He said, God tells us to follow our leaders. Like, we have to follow the law. Like, you have to follow the law of your political leaders. That's what God tells us to do. Your landlords are telling you that you have to pay rent. God wants you to do that. You have to follow the law, otherwise there'll be chaos. This is what Luther tells them publicly. But there's an ulterior motive here. There's another thing that Luther doesn't say. Here's the thing that Luther doesn't say. He says this maybe privately to himself. Luther has to support the landlords because they are protecting him. They're protecting him from the Pope. So Luther may like what the peasants are saying. He may completely agree with their position, but he can't support them. He tells them that according to the Bible, we have to listen to our political leaders and follow the law. You have to pay your rent. But privately, he knows that it's only the landlords and the nobility in this area that are protecting him from being arrested and killed by the political leadership of the Holy Roman Empire. So Luther has to support the nobility. And unfortunately, a lot of peasants were killed because they refused to back down. So some listened to Luther and went home and begrudgingly started paying their rent, but quite a few of them had to be violently put down, and the rebellion was violently squashed, and a lot of poor people died because of what Luther did. So we'll stop here. In the next video, we'll talk about how the Reformation begins to spread, and we're going to introduce some new Reformation characters. So Luther is now going to start interacting with other Protestant figures, and we'll see how the Reformation grows and evolves after Luther. So until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.